Hey, Richard. Nice to see you again.
Hey, Rajesh. Good to see you too.
We live in the culture of the printing press, don't we? It's the first mechanized product before sewing needles and shoes and nails and screws. Here's this one thing that was actually mass produced and consumed.
Maybe this is a good point to transition to introducing our theme for the rest of this season podcast, which is AI as a culture making activity. AI makes culture.
Just as the printing press made culture.
We might be more interested in books than most people, but probably every single one of our listeners reads the printed word on an hourly basis. It's something that's just such an integral part of our world. And that's really was allowed from the automation of printing, moving written text away from being something that had to be handwritten by a scribe, maybe someone part of the literate class, to having it be an automated, inexpensive activity. Some people have argued that it really pushed this shift or pivot in a capitalistic direction. You had the production of books, but just generally of information from a clerical, a religious, and a scribe class to being a profit-making enterprise run by print.
Not just in terms of the books that were being printed, but also things that could be printed and shared, like budgets and all kinds of business-related activities.
A lot of it was simply driven by the cost of producing text. One sort of estimate is that over the course of 100 years, that the price of printing, let's say, to a certain amount, like pages, that the cost in real terms, so if you measure it in terms of a worker's daily wages, that it fell by a factor of 100, that it went from taking around approximately days of the average worker's wages to buy a text of that size. And then after 100 years of the printing press, that it was about 1 day's wage.
That might have been the original Moore's Law. Huh? The printing press made culture, and it made all the disciplines that we now think of as cultural disciplines. Education, healthcare, and the arts, and technology, of course, and religion. They're all part of print culture.
The whole of society changed from this one technology.
We don't read books loudly. The culture of reading is that of silence, and you are alone with your thoughts when you're reading. And so there's the production of that individual who's somewhat isolated from the rest of society, is in communion with the author of the book, but otherwise is isolated. People did not experience texts like that before. Oh, they were read in communal settings, right? Probably because they couldn't read, but even if they could, it was done with others.
Certain people could read, typically that you have a scholarly class who could read and write and were responsible for that. If you think about religious texts, there was certainly a real shift in moving from having the religious text be something that's owned communally and controlled by the religious authorities to it being something that's accessible just in your own home. A lot of cultural shifts that come from that.
And especially for religion, it allows what we would now call fundamentalism, right? Because you can say that it's the authority of the text that precedes the authority of the priest or the intermediary. And that's possible because you have access to the text without the intermediary being with you.
We can argue about the meaning of the text separate from the authority figure. The text is the authority.
And it also makes possible lay authority figures, people who come up through the ranks rather than being inducted through the priesthood.
This real specific technology of the printing press resulted in a lot of cultural changes that really couldn't have been foreseen when the technology was being developed, and really couldn't have been foreseen for decades, even centuries.
Relative to 14 or whenever Duke first published his Bible, we are in an unrecognizable world.
I think it's exciting. You mentioned the internet age earlier. Certainly in industrialized societies, the vast majority of people are literate. But until recently, only a few people were authors. Only a few people were writing those books. That the printing press itself was a kind of a gateway to being an author as opposed to only a reader. And that's something that's really changed in the past 20 years or so. If you think about the ability to join conversations in written form. It's something that people do now through social media and internet forums like Reddit or Twitter.
Or even just texting each other.
Even before we start thinking about artificial intelligence, just some of these other technological from recent decades are potentially yielding large cultural changes on the scale, maybe even of the printing press.
If you think of AI not as a miracle technology that has emerged from nowhere, but as a culmination of this cluster of internet plus computing technologies, then they're already living in that revolution as opposed to waiting for it to happen.
Right. And maybe one of the things you're thinking about there is the large language models requiring such giant bodies of text to learn on.
Since you mentioned the authorial capacity as opposed to just the capacity to read, how long will it be before being an author is more a question of directing AI rather than actually setting those words on paper or images?
That it might be typical to direct the AI, whether that's through prompts or some other kind of interface that hasn't been created yet, to produce the kind of vision that you have in mind, some thought process, and the AI will simply be more efficient at putting the words down.
And this too continues with the history of, say, software production. People used to write on punch cards. Now nobody would write that kind of code. People just understand that new abstractions make it possible to be more creative at a higher level than you could be before. And maybe that's what's going to happen with the production of text. If AI is what allows computing to transition into culture, as opposed to just a specialized activity, then what programmers have experienced in the last 40, 50 years might be everybody's experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The ability to realize some kind of idea in a computational form. Thinking about other kinds of culture making, the art that I would think of first as being relevant to being created by the AI is, of course, illustration, drawing, photography, even now is being created by DALL-E and Midjourney. And you could say literature also from the text-based chatbots. The aesthetics and the arts are a place where already having an impact, culture making. What else do you see as being interesting places where culture is being made or could be made through?
I definitely think of therapy as a big possibility. It's expensive, but it's a part of Western culture, and people derive value from being in therapy. But as we are in a more and more complex society, having somebody who's a wise counselor all the time as opposed to once a week for 45 minutes has real value.
Yeah, I think therapy, it's an interesting example also because like with the arts, like with religion, it's resisted automation to a large extent. We have a lot of therapists. The number of therapists is growing because the personal interaction seems to have been a critical piece of it. And the technologies that we've had until recently have not been good at automating these human service industries would be one way to think of it, or culture jobs, culture work, to use another way to think about it.
But as our populations age and there are fewer younger people than there are older people, some of these care professions are going to need mechanization of some kind or the other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We see this already in Japan with its even more aging population and the interest in robotics for having robotic human aides or, say, healthcare aides to help the elderly.
It's unlikely to be dramatic where suddenly you only see robots in hospitals, but there will be encroachment. Slowly, you'll see some functions at the margins being performed by machines. And so it'll co-evolve rather than just replace, in my view.
Right. I'm thinking about therapy. It reminds me of maybe 20 years ago or so, I had a little app or something that you could download I had a Windows machine, and it was, I think, a cat that would walk back and forth on top of different windows. So if you had an email window open, then you could drag the cat up to the top of it and it would pace back and forth. And you could move it someplace else, and it would occasionally sit or look at you. And I remember it felt like a creature. This sort of ability to humanize or agents, or not even agents, but creatures that we interact with, is a growth area. Having AIs that we interact with, whether it's for therapy itself or if it's just companionship. Of course, this is already happening, but it's hard to imagine it not continuing to grow.
I'm thinking emojis. I resisted emojis for a while, but now I'm a diehard emoji fan. I feel like emojis are the best thing that have ever happened to interpersonal communication. And I'm
They kind
thinking,
of do something that words don't.
yeah. And what would smart emojis be like? You know, emojis that had a little bit of agency to them. That could be a micro AI-driven grammar to our interactions. So emojis that would look different based on what the mood of the person who was sending it, or the other way around. Just a little bit of context behavior might do a lot.
It's certainly not hard to think about how AI could be relevant for political culture making.
Of course. Not sure it will be anything good. Frankly, right? It's so much easier for me to imagine the dystopia end of that than the utopia end.
It is. Yeah. What positive could come of intersection of politics and AI? Can we think of anything? Because I agree. I have the same intuition. It just, you say those two things together, it just seems like, oh my.
Maybe I'm just not thinking creatively enough. It still would be dystopian to the other side, but if my tribe is able to use AI to propagate its ideology faster than it could have before, right? Maybe we will just get better at quickly creating interesting political narratives. I'm somewhat agnostic as to whether they're good or bad. This goes back to everybody being an author from only a few people being authors. Like, being a politician is a pretty small, closed category. And I'm wondering if more people will be capable of being leaders as a result of these micro narratives that could emerge.
A kind of a, not democratization, but a expanding the circle of the political class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder. That's an interesting question. Certainly, coming back to the printing press, it resulted in the expansion of literacy, almost certainly. Now, thinking about AI as culture making, maybe for myself at least, the piece that I'm the most familiar with, the most in the trenches on, so to speak, is education, since I'm a professor and I teach regularly. And so that's something that I've been thinking about.
Is there anything utopian, or is that also all dystopia right now?
I think there's a lot of potential with it.
Uh-huh.
A couple of things that sort of jump out would include personalized learning. There's the potential to have training and have teaching, have it be automated and tailored to the individual at the same time without requiring a human. Thinking about education generally, whether it's K-12 education in the US or higher education, always the class size matters, the ratio of the teachers, the students is probably the biggest lever that you have. It's better to have more teachers relative to fewer students. And I think that AI has the potential to leverage the number of students that can be taught effectively by a teacher.
And also maybe change the function of the teacher from being the person who delivers the standard content to being the person who responds in a more personalized fashion.
Yeah, because so much of the role of teaching is something more akin to coaching. Right? It's encouraging, it's providing a kind of emotional support, helping the student feel comfortable and interested and engaged with the material. And as social creatures, that human connection is so critical. And that will continue to be important, that having at least the feeling that there's a human who actually knows you and cares about you and is helping you, that feeling will continue to be fairly necessary for most learning environments.
Actually, let me double down on that. As some of the information transfer side of teaching is taken up by, maybe there will be more emphasis in the training of teachers on these emotional affective aspects, and that teachers will be both trained and evaluated on those caregiving aspects more explicitly.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I hope so. And you could see that for other areas as well, like medicine or other kinds of high touch interactions. But staying with teaching, I think we've already seen that. I'm not a historian of education, but that's my sense is that education over the past century has moved very much in the direction of being more explicitly caring. There's less of think about American education. We don't put kids in the corner with a dunce cap on anymore. We don't. There's not that kind of shaming and punishment. It's much more oriented toward a caring environment. Now, that might partly just be the culture in general, but I don't think so. I think that a lot of it has had to do with what's effective for teaching.
And this is where I think AI makes culture is such an important possibility, because in a knowledge society where you want people to be inquisitive and creative, partly for economic reasons, it's good for teachers to be caring, because that's what cultivates the personality who will then go on to design iPhones.
We're probably training fewer factory workers in the future than we were a generation or two or three ago.
And I think disciplining was such a huge part of becoming a factory worker, right? Like you had to learn how to take orders and do exactly the same thing all day long. And school was the training ground for that. And we don't think of school anymore as that space.
I think there are other things that AI will be helpful for automating tasks, the same kinds of things that it can do in most any other context. In this case, maybe it could be better at doing grading, for example, or some of the things that take a lot of time for teachers. But, interestingly, something that's distinctive for education about this AI moment with the introduction of the LLMs is that at least above a certain grade level, I don't know, I'm going to guess approximately middle school and up, that every educator has to think about it now. It's not just sort of, gee, maybe there are things that could be helpful. Here are some helpful tools, the way there are other helpful tools that I might like to spend time learning about, but don't necessarily have to. But everyone has to think about the ability of students to use the LLMs for cheating, right? For circumventing the goals of an assessment. A lot of these tools are just really good at answering the kinds of questions that teachers have been in the habit of asking students, because those questions forced a student to learn to internalize the material. And now that's not as much required if there's the ability to use the LLM.
Do you think that's already happening to you personally?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's happening to me. It's happening at my institution. It's happening at schools, universities, I'm sure around the world. Because I think about kinds of assignments I used to give, and many of them, maybe the assignment was completed on a computer anyway. And before, of course, the internet existed, books existed, someone could look up answers, but those answers weren't quite as readily available. And the ability to find them, of course, is right. And it's a lot easier to come up with questions that someone could find the answer to in an appropriate text. But if they did, then you'd be happy with that, because then they're learning through that process. Whereas now you can just often just put the question, the assignment of the teacher right into the AI as a prompt, and it will give you a really good answer to it, to the question. Things like factual questions, right? Things like summarizing a text, even a relatively sophisticated text like a peer-reviewed scientific journal article. If you ask certain basic kinds of questions like what's the hypothesis and what methods were used and what were the results and what were limitations, things like that, they can do it. The AIs can do a really good job with that.
I've actually seen that in the classroom context, but there are services, especially in the biomedical literature world, where there are so many papers published every year. They are marketing these services to researchers saying, we we have ingested zillions of papers, and if you have a query, there will be a summary answer along with the appropriate references that you'll get back in response.
Yeah.
And that might be useful, right? If I want to figure out what experiment I should be doing next and what other people are doing, this could be an interesting way as a professional to navigate the information.
I've tried using some of these services myself for my own research, and I haven't yet found any that I experienced to be very useful. However, I could certainly see maybe if you're a journalist or maybe some kind of lawyer or someone who needs to be able to digest technical information. My father is a retired trial lawyer, and he would often need to read medical journal articles or things like that. He wasn't trained in that area, but he learned, how to do it. But I'm sure it would have saved him a lot of time to be able to just
Interesting.
ask that kind of question of an AI.
So adjacent specialties and not your own.
Right. Kind of widening of the circle, letting these kinds of specialist activities or texts become accessible to a wider audience. I could definitely see that happening now.
And again, in the healthcare world, I know that in the last 20 years, there's been such a huge upsurge of patient rights or people becoming lay experts on typically things that matter to them, right? Whether it's a healthcare issue of their own or somebody that they love. And because there's so much information online, you can research attention deficit disorder, any of the other things that somebody could have. I feel like AI could make that even more approachable than it is today.
Yes. Yeah. I think so. So that's a way in which thinking about AI is making culture there around personal health. It's easy to see how there's going to be a change in that direction of making it easier for us to learn about health and medical issues that affect us. Coming back to education, it's interesting that way that I think for educators, we're forced into interacting with it. I hope that's a good thing in that if we overcome this short-term hump of needing to think a little bit differently about what kinds of assignments we're giving and why we're giving them so that we can give new assignments that still serve the goal of learning, that it will at the same time expose educators to these new technologies, and that will hopefully jumpstart getting us to thinking about what are ways that it can be used to increase learning.
And given that students are already using and other technologies, might it not be worth it to co-design future evaluative exercises with them? They recognize, like everybody does, that you need some skills to thrive. And so what's the best way to evaluate me in the skills that I believe I need, right?
Right. Yeah. That's certainly one kind of direction that some educators are taking in some contexts, especially if you have a context maybe with relatively mature students that are in a position where they are ready to take ownership of their education, then I think that could be a good model, what you're describing.
I hope that these experiments continue so that new forms of both instruction and evaluation come up to replace the ones that are going to be solved by AI.
I'm not really worried. I think this is just a short-term issue of trying to come up with ways to deal with assignments that are not AI-proof, as it were. I think it's actually a gift to educators that it's forcing us to learn more about new forms of AI, because ultimately, and really this comes back to our theme for this season of AI making culture, is that I'm mostly confident that AI will have a positive effect on us in the long run. There are going to be a lot of bumps along the way, but the ability for people to have more of a role in making culture, making visual works of art. It used to take years of training to be able to do something as well as what we can now request from Midjourney or DALL-E or Stable Diffusion. There are some clear negatives in the short term, at least, around artists being paid for their work and being able to make a living, and what's the value that's added by having someone internalize that image making
Mm,
skill through their own mind rather than offloading it.
mm.
I think there are losses along those lines, but I believe that in the long run, there will be a net growth in culture and cultural complexity in modes of expression that are going to come out of AI.
I agree. But I also think that these culture making communities need to very actively experiment with these tools so that they come up with new procedures, new rituals, new processes that enhance their lives. And who best to do it? It's educators who should be doing it for education and doctors for healthcare and so on.
So we're hoping to have some of these conversations over the coming episodes to help ourselves and our listeners start thinking about some of these issues so that we can work through them together. Rajesh and I are not experts in the technology of AI. We're really interested lay people when it comes to exactly how these are made. And we're hoping that these conversations will bring other people along with us, exploring how AI can be used to make culture and what are some of the pitfalls and what are the opportunities.
Yeah. May this category of interested lay people expand as a result of access to these technologies. And we don't know what's going to come out of it. And we are in for the ride as much as anybody else. Lots of ideas that we hopefully will be exploring in future episodes.
Great talking to you as always, Rajesh.
Bye, Richard.